Hi, everyone. Welcome to this discussion hosted by the team at EnergyX Solutions, where we'll talk to industry and thought leaders about the latest and greatest in energy. We'll discuss trends, we'll discuss expectations, and the realities of what it takes to be successful in this space, especially with a lot of the changing paradigms that exist now. My name is Maitreyi. I'm here with Jesse Hitchcock, and today we're going to be talking to Rich Huntley. Rich is a consultant who helps to bring innovative solutions and innovative approaches as well to more rapidly scale demand side management for a host of different energy entities. So over to you, Jesse. You want to kick off the conversation with Rich?
Yeah, sweet. So I think just to set it up a little bit, obviously, before we even got started, we were talking about some of the ways that just day-to-day life obviously has changed since all of this, and we've been having to kind of adapt and adjust. And I think something we kind of wanted to center these conversations around is just what is our new reality when it comes to delivering energy audits in particular, because we're seeing now that a lot of efficiency programs have halted because we can't send anyone to the house anymore. So yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of what this new reality is, and is it just a pause, or is there something like greater we should be learning from this?
Yeah, I think concern about going into people's homes, I think is going to linger for a while. I mean, personally, early on in this whole pandemic, even before we were in quote unquote lockdown, um, and we were just socially distancing, I bumped into a friend who's a contractor, and he'd already had three jobs cancelled because basically people didn't want people in, someone they didn't know in their house, right?
That's
So
not just auditors, like an actual contractor too.
yeah, an actual contractor. He's self-employed, just a one-man band, does relatively small jobs, not like complete builds or commercial. So residential work, typically, adding on a bedroom or replacing something. And he'd already had jobs cancelled. So I think it's going to be a while, and there's been some debate even around things like sporting events. When you are allowed to go, what's the resistance to actually going? I mean, I think we've seen that in China as well, where I think it was in Wuhan, they lifted the lockdown, but people are behaving like they're still in lockdown. So,
Yeah.
I think that's going to get people to rethink a lot of things. I see even Dr. Fauci was talking about maybe it's a great opportunity to abandon the handshake. It wasn't a great idea in the first place, right? Let's take our sweaty palm and rub it against someone else's sweaty palm and see what happens. So
Yeah.
I think I think there's a lot of those processes are going to be rethought, and I think it's a great opportunity to rethink the energy efficiency process. Obviously, you know, it's hard. It's going to be probably not in my lifetime where you can, you know, pull off the outside clapboards and reinstall, insulation without going to someone's house. So I don't expect drones to come to my house in foreseeable future and replace my insulation. But I think there's a lot we can do. I think we can take a cue from things like telemedicine. If you think about how we're looking at telemedicine, even our local, relatively rural hospital says, don't go to the doctor, get on the phone and video first. And I was listening to an interview by Kara Swisher of Deepak Chopra, and he was talking about what they're doing, not only for physical health, but trying to diagnose mental health and emotional health, looking at cues, videos, sensors, our universal Fitbits and data and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't see why we can't apply some of that to things like looking at energy and energy audits, energy assessments. So I think if you think about it, if we can decide our health, physical and mental, remotely, we should be able to understand quite a bit about our houses without having to use our traditional process.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the doctor's offices, because it's been really interesting to see how they have pivoted so quickly to doing, like, consults over the phone, consults over Zoom. And it's, when you start reflecting on that, at first it seems like, oh, that's weird, I need to see a doctor. But then when you actually think about what you do at a doctor's office, like, doing it over Zoom really isn't that different from what you do when you go there. And I guess I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, like, if what would be different about doing like an energy audit remotely versus going to the house? Like what would be like or maybe like where would that be challenging, I guess, or like what would be fundamentally different?
Yeah, what's interesting, a lot of the traditional companies running some of these programs are now quote unquote doing remote audits. But what they're really doing is they're doing the same audit they used to do, but with the homeowner gathering the data, right? So they're still collecting data from the homeowner, putting it in the same modeling or spreadsheet platforms they used to put it in. And all they're doing there is moving the data capture. I think the opportunity is to do a lot more than that, right? We've got access to energy bills. We've got access to public access data. We've got access to modeling. We've got access to machine learning. So, rather than just say, okay, let's do the same audit we used to do, but change the data capture part of the process, why don't we just rethink it and start taking a data-driven, an analytics-driven approach to really assessing those buildings? You look at what data, depending on where you are, you can get about the house. You look at how you can understand utility bills and understand what's going on. At the simplest level, I have a smart meter on my house that I had paired with a thermostat that lets me look at 15-minute data. I'm also in my utilities Powerwall program, so I've got 5-minute data from that. And I'm also, just because I'm in the business, I've got a sense there. So you look at all of those things, certain things are very obvious. I have an electric oven. You can see that going on. I don't need people to come to my house and say, oh, look, you cook with electric. You can see that in the data, right? So I think there's a lot of those things. You've got a sense of seeing how efficient the heating and cooling might be within the data. So I think there's a great many things that we can do, starting with data and getting that level of analysis and really changing the paradigm a lot more than saying, okay, let's do exactly what we used to do, but let's email the data capture part to the auditor. I think we can take out that auditor there to use things like, modeling, potentially even some better imaging, those kind of technologies.
That's really, really insightful. I actually want to underscore a point that I feel like you made a couple times now, which is that there is a wealth of information that is being captured through a lot of means already. And because of this paradigm shift that we're talking about, there is an opportunity to use all of that information in really meaningful ways and new ways, frankly. But it's not, the challenge is not capturing the data, because the data already exists, which is really, really cool. So actually kind of to that point then, given that the data exists, given that, let's say that it can be used in effective ways going forward, how would you sort of structure something remote and something like some kind of virtual engagement with your customer to make sure that it is successful? Like, what does success look like in like a virtual engagement space, given that we have all these data points? Like, what metrics should we be looking at?
Yeah, I think I would look first at the process, right? Because we can do things differently doesn't mean we have to do the same way. So if you think about the current process is typically where an individual homeowner or occupier decides to take an action, right? Either that action is because they're aware, or they've been made aware, or they got a flyer from, I'm in Vermont, so Efficiency Vermont, all those kind of things. That's a very sort of random process, right? So, out of the 500,000 customers a utility might have, you rely on a sort of random chances that some of them are going to start a process, right? That process could be buying something and applying for a rebate, because I bought a new fridge and I've got Energy Star, or it could be asking for an assessment of my home because, I want to take some action. Maybe I'm doing some other construction and I want to make that energy efficient. Well, if we're going to change the process and use, we kind of have to do that process if we got to go to someone's house.
Sure.
Right? We can't proactively walk our way through 500,000 houses, starting with the northernmost town to the southernmost town or something. That's not going to be practical. But if we're doing it off of data, we can start with a very broad funnel, which is fairly easily analyze every house. right? Analyze those that have the opportunities. So those are the ones we reach out to. And we can reach out with very one-to-one messages. If you've analyzed my house and you've got a pretty good sense that my problem is insulation, because you're looking at weather sensitivity and looking at modeling and everything else, then you can not only reach out to me as a good candidate worth spending money on, versus maybe Tree at your house. Your house might have been built just last year. You're in the business, so you sort out a very energy efficient house. Well, if I know that from the data, I'm not going to spend my time doing mailings to you necessarily, because you don't have the potential savings. Come to my house because I've got a 50-year-old home, and obviously you can see in the data that it needs help. So if you're doing that, that lets you really rethink the process, right? So you focus on the houses that have the best potential. You reach out with individual messages to those people that can resonate. The last thing you want to do is send me a message. I'll pick on my local phone company that does this all the time. It sends me flyers they've got a great new offer for DSL. I know from experience I'm too far from the central office to get DSL. So all they've done is make me mad, because they've teased me with something I can't buy. And if I'm having a really bad day, I call them up and ask them for it, and then they tell me they can't have it, right?
Oh, so actually, yeah.
if I'm really feeling mean, I say, you've sent me this, that's great, can I have it? And they say, oh no. So why are you sending it to me? Don't you know from the data, your data, not my data, you don't need any of my data, it's your network, that what services you can offer me and what you can't. So I think we can do those same things. Don't go pitching people on, we've got this great program for window replacements if it's a brand new house and you can tell that the code was such that those windows are going to be great windows, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about because we've been thinking about this in terms of like every industry, like after this, like how do we do things better? How do we make sure we can do things digitally? Like it's illuminated this problem, but I think your point that we don't need to just do the same things digitally after this. Like we don't need to just all of a sudden take the exact same process and replicate it digitally. We can actually use this as an opportunity to make better processes and like change the way we're doing things. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And then when you rethink those processes, the metrics flow out of that, right? It's going to be optimized spend on marketing, hopefully more engagement, hopefully better conversions, because the whole idea of an audit, it's not a goal, it's a step towards a goal. The goal is the measure, right? So that to the extent you can keep as much money as possible focused on buying down the cost of the measure with a rebate or whatever it is, and you're putting your money to work, and the more of that money that goes to the KWH rather than that goes to the other parts of the process, the marketing spend, the cost of the assessment, the travel costs of going to the house, that's not where we want to put the money, right? We want to put the money to the people, and then you can add on to that, how do we help those people that maybe we prioritize that money for low income and some of those kind of things. Some recent data I think showed that about 50% of the people in the US are worried about their utility bill, and about 16 or 17 think they have trouble paying it. So we can put the money there. I was thinking about, in preparation for this, I was going to, if I could go out and get it done, put a T-shirt together that said "Money to the measure." Because I think that's what we've got to do, is get the money to the measure and be as efficient as we can with all the other stuff.
I think if I totally agree, but I think if I was playing devil's advocate, I would say that, we've been delivering energy efficiency programs, especially in a regulated capacity, for a long time. And we know exactly what to expect of these various processes. We know how many savings we can claim from different actions, whether that's marketing or whether that's an actual measure. So I think, the pushback I would say is, well, if we change these processes, then how do we measure and evaluate the programs? Like, what does it mean for M&V?
Yeah, well, there's two elements to that. There's sort of we spend a lot of money on M&V, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, right? Not necessarily to make sure we're as efficient and effective as possible, but in large part to make sure we're as compliant as possible, right? So, I mean, in crazy, I think I remember a former colleague of mine throwing out the idea that if we abandoned M&V, right, was the wastage of money going to be less or greater than the amount we spent on M&V? Right. So, and I'm not saying abandon M&V, but I think that's a valid question, right? We spend a lot of money on M&V because we want to count for it right. We don't want to, understand that it was free ridership. We're obsessed with free ridership.
Yeah.
Right? So in most other businesses.
Why do you think that is, Rich? What do you think is the the why are we so obsessed with that?
I think I don't want to say overly sensitive, but we're highly sensitive to the fact that this is ratepayer money, right? This is not shareholder money. If you think about other businesses, think about the sort of the Amazon cousin to free ridership. Amazon spends probably more money and has more thinking on what we do and why we do, right? But if someone just randomly goes and spends another $1,000 on Amazon in a year that they didn't predict, they don't say, well, we better send that $1,000 back because we weren't using our analytics properly. We should have known Rich Huntley was going to suddenly have this desperate need because he listened to Tree and go multi-monitor and buy 3 27-inch monitors, which our analytics said he can't possibly buy 3 monitors because we know there's only 2 people in his house, right? And he bought 2 monitors over the last year. So he mustn't ever buy 3 monitors. So if he's buying 3 monitors, we'll reject his order, right? I mean,
although, just to be clear, multi-monitor is a hill I'm willing to die on.
so we would send that, so we're worried about the fact that, people got into our program that sort of by accident. Maybe we should just be thankful that they got into our program by accident. So I think we've got to rethink M&V, and I think we can do that with some of the same data. Right, the analytics we do to analyze the home, how we can leverage that to how we analyze our funnel, how we progress people through that, then maybe we can get away with less money spent on M&V because we've done so much data capture during the process. We have so much understanding of how we progress people through this funnel that maybe we can do that rather than saying, okay, we have to use whatever method, a sampling method after the fact, or we have to start thinking of control groups who don't participate. So I think this whole data can create a rethink for M&V as well, ideally to make it as cost effective as possible.
Sure. I actually want to go back to something that you had said earlier, and frankly, something that I would very much like on a bumper sticker, which is the goal is not the audit, the goal is the measure.
Right.
And I think that historically we've all seen, audits work. Like they work to get the conversion into these sort of the deep retrofits and these really heavy lift programs for customers to participate in. And audits are a great way to kind of drive participation into those things. But they're really only cost effective if you have a really high conversion rate because they're expensive to do. So the digitization that we're talking about and that you put so beautifully, which is that you're getting all these operational savings. You're getting savings in terms of sending somebody out there. You're getting savings in terms of, how the audit itself is conducted, in terms of you have the data, you're not going out there collecting the data. And there's all these different things that are just cheaper when you do them digitally. And as well as the way you're targeting customers, you're not targeting this everybody in your population and hoping that 10% are going to stick. Rather, you're having a reversal of targeting where you do the analysis and then you target who is most appropriate. And as a utility, you can do really cool things like couple the findings of your audit with, what kind of rate are they on? Like if the most beneficial program to them is going to be expensive measure programs, like, you're changing out your HVAC, changing out your insulation, things that will cost thousands of dollars. Perhaps it's an opportunity to put them on a financing plan. Perhaps, and there's all these really cool cross-functional things that arrive out of it. Uh, but they today are quite expensive to do when you're looking at it from a more archaic lens. So from our discussion, what it sounds like to me is that it's important to look at the operational benefits of digitization beyond just sort of your traditional KWH savings. Is that a fair characterization of what you've been saying?
Yeah, I mean, to take an example there, say you were looking to finance the measure, right? Whatever it is, new HVAC or whatever. And maybe you had a PACE program in place, or maybe it was just the utility.
Sorry.
Maybe it's just the utility. Wouldn't it be great to provide that same analysis you did to say that measure was the right cost-effective measure in a form at the same time without any extra work to the lender, so that the person lending the money could know if it was PACE or if it was, just a classic on-bill finance, those type of things, that measure was cost-effective, rather than saying at the moment, this happens obviously all the time in commercial, is not only did someone suggest to you, but now you're getting the funding. Now the bank is going to hire somebody to look at the same thing and go through the same process to make them happy. Wouldn't it be nice to know that we had an accepted set of analytics that could be shared with all the participants? Here's the home, here's the lender, here's the person doing M&V, okay, that we've got that same data. And the other thing, there's still going to be a time when someone, for certain measures, when someone has to get a level of specificity at the house. So say through analytics, I decided the best measure for Rich Huntley is insulation. Well, for a variety of historical reasons, I've got a very funny roof line on my house with different shapes and different angles. So even if it was needed for the house, someone would probably have to determine, okay, it's the roof over the main living space, it's the most cost effective. It's not the roof over the office part, right? Well, today you might do that, send someone out with an infrared camera. Well, maybe we can get shared cameras, maybe we can get, iPhone sensors, where at some stage I can take a picture of my roof on a cold night, and that data can be added in to the same data that you've used to model. So you've got this sort of virtuous circle, right? You've got, a model based on no touch with the home. You've got a little bit of touch with the home. Maybe I send you a photo of the nameplate on my HVAC. And that not only adds to the richness, but it can add to the model as well, right? So I think if you think about that, and I think that's another example. I mean, think about the world, and I'm not saying it's going to play out like this, but think about our current COVID world. Apparently, if you are a member of the press corps and you go to the White House briefing, they do a very simple forehead temperature check, right? To decide if you've got a high temperature, that they probably don't want to let you in because you're high risk. Well, say we all decide that we want to, in a pleasant way, just check on all of our friends from a temperature point of view. That probably means that there'll be an infrared sensor for an iPhone that'll be down around $20 eventually. Currently, an infrared camera, the cheaper ones are $500. I'm not going to buy one of those just to check my insulation.
Sure.
But if all of a sudden we have those, that can be added to the process, right? We think about the process that says, okay, we think it's insulation, but before the guy comes over to do it, take some pictures for me, some physical standard pictures that gives us a sense of how we've got to take, the clapboard off, and maybe some infrared pictures of your roof. And that can all be added to the analysis. It's all about, rethinking these processes in their entirety. And
where do you think this kind of, so I think, in every other sector, pretty much we see this type of thing, right? Like if I'm shopping retail online, I can just take a picture of my credit card and that can be used to verify my credit card information, and I can go through with the purchase. I can take a photo of a check and deposit it to my bank. Like, all of these things are possible. But what do you think the resistance to that is in the utility space? Like, it seems like we hear a lot of like, well, what if the customer like fakes the photo or like fakes the invoice? So we can't just let customers upload things and believe them. What do you think is like with why that tension?
Yeah, I think in any regulated business, and you can't necessarily blame the utilities alone, because obviously the regulators have a responsibility here, right? The regulatory paradigm manages against something being wrong, not manages against the largest there. As a great example you used of banks, right, with checks. They could have done that a while ago. They were also resistant because they, as an industry, there's an element of that they manage against what could go wrong, not necessarily what the maximum upside is. So, there was quite a while when we've had cameras there and we've had little apps on our phones. The deposit of a check was later on, right? It took a lot of changes where, and I'm no banking expert, but talking to people that are, regulatory changes that paper doesn't have to be passed around, and electronic standards for electronic interchange. From what I understand, all of that stuff had to happen. We had the technology to take a picture of a check and upload it.
Yeah.
Way before we had everybody comfortable that that's how you were going to deposit checks.
Yeah.
And now, I think that's going to be pushed even more. We take another code, my bank has closed, and they have a big sign that says, get the app. Please get the app, right?
Yeah.
So,
so you feel like policy is the biggest driver to technology uptake?
Yeah, I think it's entrenched infrastructure. That's utilities, how they view it. That's third-party implementers who've done it the same way and have built up a whole process and staff to do certain things a certain way. It's regulators being obsessed about, a dollar being wrongly spent versus, $100 of value being accidentally gained. And so I think it's all of those things that we have to rethink in terms of how we measure things and how we look at those processes. And as I say, you can't blame utilities alone because a regulated utility operates how it's regulated in many ways, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to your point on free ridership too. Like, utilities are forced to be concerned about this what could go wrong, or like these free riders that might be taking advantage of programs. So that's just the lens that we're viewing things, and maybe not from the side of what's the opportunity here necessarily.
For sure. That's a great point, Jesse, because I think in a private company where you see something like, I'm just making numbers, but let's say like 6% of loss or whatever, like, oh, it's just 6%. It's 94% gain is how I think we kind of organically look at it. But for a regulated utility, especially, or an energy provider, it's much more about, it's a whole 6%. It's a whole, and that is a much more impactful, like the loss that you guys are speaking about is much more impactful regardless of what proportion that is of the whole.
Yeah, I think I was trying to think of a good example, and it'll probably come to me, the second after we hang up. But, those other industries that are more focused on being directionally correct rather than being precise, right? I mean, it's sort of like
that's a great
a friend of mine, colleague I used to work with, went back to a very prestigious university, who will be nameless, to teach. And early on, there was a discussion about what they should do around energy efficiency. And he said, look, this building is 50 years old. It's a no-brainer. Let's do the windows, right? 50-year-old windows. Don't need to do a great deal of analysis. That will be a payback. He got a massive amount of pushback because they said back to him, are you sure that's absolutely the most effective use of our endowment dollars that we could do? And the answer was, no, but I know it's got a great payback. But is it the best? Well, I don't know if it's the best, but it's great. So you can see there the same sort of thing. It's like, you know, I think
it's moving in the right direction, whether or not it's like the most precise, like you said, way to do that. I guess it comes back to this quote, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying to think of that one, but you're exactly right. And that's what he faced, was that, you know, you can't, but in order to know what one thing at a very big Ivy League university is the best thing, you're going to spend a fortune there, right? Versus just saying, look, here's a simple threshold. If it's got a 2-year payback or X year payback or better, we're going to do it.
Yeah,
totally. I think as much as, I mean, I totally agree with this point, and I love that quote. But I guess a fun exercise, and kind of why we wanted to have it as our final kind of conversation point is like in a perfect world, if perfect were possible, and you had no regulatory or budget constraints, how would you hope that energy efficiency programs could be run, or what would you change about them, I guess, in a perfect world?
Yeah, I would think about it as something that has to be sold, right? I think sometimes there's a confusion between allowing eligibility to everybody versus chasing everybody, right? Nobody's going to say, you know, that you're not eligible for something. Going back to my sort of probably bad DSL example of my local telco is, you know, it's not saying that I'm not eligible for it if eventually it's technically possible, but why are you spending your money and your effort chasing me, right? Yeah. So, you know, if Efficiency Vermont has a particular program, you know, and I'm eligible for it, great. But that doesn't mean you've got to chase me as much as you chase the next person, right? You don't have to mail me your program for heat pump water heaters when the eligibility criteria is currently an electrically heated resistance water heater, and I don't heat my water with electric, so I can't participate. That doesn't mean that if I did, you know, change that or whatever. So separate that eligibility from who you want to get, and think of it as a business, right? How do I, just like in sales or anything else, how do I get my funnel? How do I know as much as I can about the customer without talking to them as early as possible? How do I get as close as probably an overused, metaphor, one-to-one approach to those customers? Now, we obviously, hopefully, will be, you know, less creepy than the Facebooks and the Amazons with our data, and a little more respectful of privacy and everything else. Because if we're not, then that's going to blow up, right? If we're going to use the data for energy efficiency, and all of a sudden, you know, I start getting mailings about, tarmacking my driveway, right? And I start to get a hint, where did that data come from? So I think, you know, it's fair to say that program administrators and utilities and vendors in the space have to be much more respectful of that data, that you don't suddenly, you know, you give a certain amount of data to the utility or an analytics company such as you guys does all of that analysis, and then all of a sudden starts sort of it appearing on Facebook. So I think we've got to be very data respectful and hold ourselves to a higher standard than, you know, some of those social media companies and stuff. But I think if we approach it much more like we have something to sell, and we need to sell it as cost effectively as possible, and we need to get as much money as we can, you know, to the per kWh. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe if you think about maybe a movement even to more pay-per-performance, but if it is pay-per-performance, then you've got to let the people choose the process. You can't say, look, this program is pay-per-performance, it's X per kilowatt hour. Oh, and by the way, we're going to evaluate you to see what individual steps you took and where you spent every piece of your money. No, if it's pay-per-performance, it's pay-per-performance, right?
Sure.
Put it on my shoulders. to get the kilowatt hours, or the utilities or whoever, and let them run free and use technology and best processes, etc., to get that.
That's very cool. I think we're coming up in time, so as awesome as this is, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to wrap. But I want to, Rich, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. Like, this has been incredibly insightful. Certainly, I think Jesse and I are probably going to want to talk to after the recording ends as well. But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rich Huntley, for taking the time to sit with us and share his powerful insights. And thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you learned something valuable here. We'll be back with another episode of EnergyX in Conversation next week. Stay tuned.